My name is Abby. I am 21 years old, a third-year sociology student at a leading urban university, and currently, I serve as the lead research intern at the Equity Collective, a non-governmental organization dedicated to deconstructing institutional barriers. My life is not merely a sequence of events, it is a rigorous, ongoing sociological experiment. I do not inhabit spaces, I audit them. I do not have friends. I have a network of peers whose emotional labor exchanges are constantly being balanced on a ledger of integral debt. To me, the world is a laboratory, and the subjects are almost always failing the test. I walked into the headquarters of the Equity Collective on a Tuesday morning, the air thick with the scent of recycled paper and the faint, lingering aroma of overpriced oat milk lattes. My role here was ostensibly to assist with policy drafting, but my self-appointed mission was far more critical. I was there to identify the subtle, insidious ways in which patriarchal hierarchy persisted even in a space that claimed to be progressive. The office was located in a renovated industrial loft, a space of exposed brick and high ceilings that should have screamed equality, but to my trained eye, it was a map of territorial aggression. Marcus, the executive director, sat in the corner suite. It wasn't a separate room. The collective prided itself on having no internal walls, but it was a corner nonetheless, flanked by two large windows and a mahogany desk that functioned as a visual barrier. This was spatial capital, a blatant manifestation of masculine dominance. Every time a junior staff member approached his desk, I saw the shift in their posture, the slight dip of the head, the benevolent smile Marcus offered in return. It was a performance of power disguised as mentorship. I noted it in my digital journal. *Subject M continues to occupy 30% more square footage than the administrative assistants. Spatial inequality remains the primary signifier of latent hierarchy. My goal for the semester was to dismantle this. I had been reading a great deal of radical spatial theory, texts that argued that walls, even metaphorical ones, were tools of containment and exclusion. If we were to truly be a collective, we had to exist in a state of radical, unfiltered transparency. I spent my lunch breaks crafting the proposal. I called it the Fluidity Initiative, a post-hierarchical spatial reconfiguration. The core of the proposal was simple: remove the desks. Remove the designated zones. Replace the furniture with modular, non-linear seating that prevented anyone from owning a corner. Everyone, including Marcus, would work from a central, open-plan hub. No private phone calls, no closed-door meetings, no hidden agendas. If a thought was worth having, it was worth sharing with the collective. This was not just about design, it was about stripping away the privacy that men so often use to consolidate power and engage in gatekeeping. I presented the idea to Marcus during our weekly inclusion huddle. I watched him carefully as I spoke, looking for the telltale signs of fragility. Marcus, I said, my voice steady and clinical, the current layout of this office serves as a physical manifestation of the very systems we claim to oppose. By occupying the corner, you are subconsciously signaling a return to the great man theory of leadership. You are hoarding light, space, and access. If we want to achieve true equity, we must embrace a panopticon of the people, a space where every interaction is visible, and, therefore, every interaction is accountable. Marcus blinked. He was a man in his late 40s who tried very hard to be an ally. He wore linen shirts and listened to podcasts about mindful leadership. He was, in my estimation, a Tier 2 reformist, someone who would change the world as long as he didn't have to give up his comfortable chair. Abby, he began, I appreciate the theoretical rigor you're bringing to this. But some of our work, especially the merger discussions with the Horizon Foundation, requires a degree of confidentiality. We're dealing with sensitive donor data and legal strategies. I felt a surge of intellectual contempt. Confidentiality, I replied, is often just a euphemism for the exclusion of marginalized voices from the decision-making process. Why should the interns not hear the strategy? Why should the sensitive data be shielded from those who do the bulk of the labor? To keep information secret is to exercise a form of epistemic violence. I saw the wince. He didn't want to be the man accused of epistemic violence by a 21-year-old intern who had just quoted 3 different French theorists in a single breath. He was terrified of being on the wrong side of my daily patriarchy report, which I published on my social media to a growing following of 3,000 ethical auditors. "Perhaps you're right," he said, his voice hesitant. "We could try a pilot program. A week of radical openness." I didn't smile. Smiling would be a form of appeasement. A week is a performance. We need a structural shift. We moved the furniture this weekend. By Monday, the office was transformed. The corner suite was gone. In its place was a sprawling, amorphous arrangement of beanbags, low-slung benches, and circular tables. There were notions. The acoustics of the room, previously dampened by cubicle walls and bookshelves, now echoed with the slightest sound. I took my place at a central table, my laptop open, my eyes scanning the room. I felt like a sentry at the gates of a new civilization. The first few hours were a study in discomfort, which I interpreted as the detoxification process of the ego. Sarah, the lead advocate, tried to make a phone call to a victim of housing discrimination. Because there were no private nooks, her voice carried across the entire floor. "I'm so sorry, Mrs. Gable," Sarah said, hunched over her phone, her hand cupped around her mouth. "I can't. I'm in a very open space right now." "Yes, I understand the urgency." I watched as Sarah's shoulders climbed toward her ears. I noted, *subject S exhibiting privacy withdrawal. Internalized need for secrecy is hindering the communal flow of empathy, *. Across the room, Marcus was trying to review a contract. Every 5 minutes, he was interrupted. Since he no longer had a desk that signaled "do not disturb," people felt free to wander over and ask him about the coffee machine, the printer settings, or their weekend plans. He was losing his executive focus, which I found delightful. If he couldn't handle the interruptions that the rest of us faced daily, he didn't deserve his position. By Wednesday, the open office crisis began to transition from a social experiment into a functional catastrophe. The noise was no longer a communal hum, it was a cacophony. The sound of 3 different Zoom calls, a podcast being edited in the corner, and the constant clatter of the communal kitchen merged into a disorienting wall of sound. "Abby," Sarah whispered, approaching my table. She looked exhausted. "I can't concentrate. I've had to take 3 calls in the hallway by the elevators. It's freezing out there, and I'm pretty sure the janitor heard everything about the Gable case." "The hallway is a liminal space, Sarah," I said, not looking up from my screen. "Perhaps you should consider why you feel the need to hide your advocacy. Is it because you feel the collective isn't capable of holding that space with you?" Sarah stared at me. "No, Abby, it's because I'm a lawyer and I have a duty of confidentiality to my clients. If I breach that, I lose my license. This isn't a sociology seminar, it's a law firm." "A law firm is a colonial construct," I reminded her. She walked away, and I added her to my stagnation list. She was becoming an obstacle to the evolution of the office. She was too attached to the professional standards designed by white men in the 19th century. Then came the Horizon merger. This was the crown jewel of the Equity Collective's year, a planned union with the Horizon Foundation, a massive international entity that would provide us with the funding to go global. It was a delicate, high-stakes negotiation. Marcus had been working on it for months. On Thursday afternoon, a delegation from Horizon arrived for a final walkthrough and a cultural assessment. They were older, polished, and clearly confused by the sight of the executive director sitting on a neon green beanbag with a laptop on his knees. Marcus tried to maintain his dignity. "Welcome to our new collaborative ecosystem," he said, struggling to stand up from the beanbag without losing his balance. "We've moved toward a model of radical transparency to reflect our core values." The lead negotiator for Horizon, a woman named Eleanor who looked like she was carved out of marble, raised an eyebrow. "Transparency is admirable, Marcus. But we are here to discuss the sensitive matter of the Aegis endowment. As you know, that information is strictly embargoed until the contracts are signed. Is there a private room where we can review the figures?" I stepped forward before Marcus could answer. "Privacy is the shroud of the elite, Eleanor. Here at the Collective, We believe that if a deal is ethical, it should be able to withstand the gaze of the entire community. Eleanor looked at me as if I were a peculiarly uninteresting species of insect. And who are you? I am the ethical auditor of this space, I said. Marcus looked like he wanted to dissolve into the floor. Abby is our lead intern. Abby, perhaps you could go check on the catering. I am not a domestic laborer, Marcus, I said, my voice cold. I will stay and witness the dialogue. The meeting proceeded in the center of the room. There was no other choice. They sat at a circular table, and the rest of the office, all 15 of us, sat within earshot. The air was thick with tension. I wasn't just listening, I was recording. Not with a device, but with my mind, cataloging the way they talked about mitigating risk and streamlining assets. It was the language of capitalism, polished to a high sheen. As the discussion turned to the Aegis Endowment, a multi-million-dollar fund that was the backbone of the merger, the room went silent. Eleanor began to list the conditions. The endowment was tied to a specific set of land rights in the global south. We need to ensure, Eleanor said, her voice carrying easily through the open loft, that the local resistance movements are managed. We can't have the branding of the collective tarnished by association with radical fringe groups that might resort to, shall we say, non-traditional protest methods. A gasp went through the office. Managed, someone whispered. I didn't whisper. I stood up. By managed, you mean suppressed. You are asking the Equity Collective to facilitate the silencing of indigenous activists in exchange for a check. This isn't a merger. It's a buyout of our integrity. The Horizon team froze. Marcus turned to me, his face pale. Abby, please. This is a nuanced discussion about strategic alignment. There is no nuance in oppression, Marcus. I shouted. My voice was a clarion call. You are selling the revolution for a corner office that doesn't even exist anymore. The meeting collapsed. Eleanor stood up, her face a mask of professional disappointment. It seems, Marcus, that your radical transparency has revealed a fundamental lack of institutional discipline. We can't partner with an organization that allows its interns to dictate the terms of a multi-million-dollar international agreement. We will be taking the Aegis Endowment to the Prosperity Institute instead. The Prosperity Institute was our primary rival, a right-leaning think tank that would use the money to promote market-based solutions to poverty. They would have no qualms about managing resistance. The Horizon delegation walked out. The silence that followed was heavy, suffocating. Marcus didn't move from his chair. He looked older, smaller. Abby, he said quietly. That endowment was going to fund our entire housing program for the next 5 years. We were going to use that money to provide legal defense for 3,000 families. Yes, the terms were difficult, and we were going to negotiate them down. But now there is no money. There is no program. And the Prosperity Institute will use those funds to do the exact opposite of everything we stand for. I saved our soul, I said, though my heart was hammering in my chest. We cannot do good with blood money. You didn't save anything, Sarah said, standing up from her desk. Her voice was shaking with rage. You just made sure that 3,000 families will be evicted, so you could feel intellectually superior for 20 minutes. You think this is a game? You think these theories you read are more important than the actual lives of the people we serve? You're reacting from a place of fear, Sarah, I said, trying to regain my composure. You're prioritizing immediate material gain over long-term systemic purity. Systemic purity? Sarah laughed, a harsh, jagged sound. You live in a dorm paid for by your parents, Abby. You go to a school with a $3 billion endowment. You don't know what it's like to actually need something. You're not an auditor, you're a tourist. One by one, they began to pack their bags. The week of radical openness was over, but not because the walls were going back up. It was over because the collective was breaking A. The loss of the Horizon merger was a death blow. Without those funds, the lease on the loft couldn't be paid. The staff would have to be let go. I stood in the center of the room, the architect of this new world, and realized I was standing alone. In the days that followed, the fallout was swift. I was released from my internship, a term Marcus used with a grim irony. I tried to post about it, to frame it as a martyrdom for the cause of transparency, but the response was different this time. My peers on social media, the ones who usually cheered my critiques, were silent. Or worse, they were critical. Asterisk at radical reason asterisk. Wait, so you blew up a 5-year housing fund for a vibe check? Not sure this is the one you think it is, Abby. Asterisk at socio queen asterisk. Transparency is great, but did you consider the emotional labor of the staff who now have no jobs? This feels like class-privileged sabotage. I blocked them. I blocked all of them. They weren't radical enough. They were compromised by the pragmatism of the status quo. I told myself this as I sat in my studio Ament, a perfectly curated space where every book was aligned by the height of the author's revolutionary potential. I had created the perfect environment. No one could disappoint me here. No one could manspread on my vintage velvet sofa. No one could offer me benevolent sexism in the form of a held door or a paid-for coffee. I was the sole sovereign of a 10 by 10 kingdom of ethical purity. But the silence of the Ament started to feel different than the silence of the office. In the office, the silence had been a weapon, a way to exert pressure, to observe, to judge. Here, the silence was just empty. I looked at my phone. I had no messages. I had cut ties with my lesser friends months ago, the ones who wanted to go to mainstream movies or who didn't understand why I refused to date anyone who hadn't read at least 3 volumes of The History of Sexuality. I had pruned my social circle until it was a single, perfect bud, me. I decided to go to the third wave coffee shop down the street, the Fermented Bean. I needed to be around people, if only to observe their failings. I needed the friction of the world to remind me that I was right. I sat at a small, marble-topped table and ordered a pour-over. I watched the barista, a young man with a man bun and a tax the rich apron. He was being performatively helpful to an elderly woman, explaining the tasting notes of the Ethiopian blend. Subject be engaging in ageist condescension, I thought, reaching for my notebook. Assuming the elderly subject lacks the palate for complex acidity. I waited for the familiar rush of intellectual superiority, the feeling of being the only person in the room who truly saw the matrix of power. But it didn't come. Instead, I felt a strange, hollow ache in my chest. I looked at the elderly woman. She was smiling. She looked happy to be talked to, happy to be learning something new, even if the barista was being a bit of a snob. They were having a connection. It was messy, it was imperfect, it was probably rife with unconscious bias, but it was real. I looked down at my notebook. I had hundreds of pages of these observations. Thousands of words dedicated to the flaws of others. And what did I have to show for it? I had saved a collective by destroying it. I had liberated an office by making it unworkable. I had purified my life by making it empty. I thought about Sarah. I thought about the families she was trying to help. I had called her compromised, but she was the one out there in the cold hallways, doing the work, while I sat in the warmth of my own judgment. I picked up my phone. I went to Sarah's contact. I started to type, asterisk, I'm sorry. I was wrong. The theory didn't account for the human cost, asterisk. My thumb hovered over the send button. But then I stopped. If I sent that, I would be admitting that my entire framework was flawed. I would be admitting that I was low vibrational, that I had succumbed to the internalized pressure of social harmony. I would be just like everyone else, messy, contradictory, and wrong. I looked at the screen. I looked at the send button. I deleted the message. I closed my notebook. I stood up, left my half-finished, perfectly extracted coffee on the table, and walked out of the shop. I walked back to my Ament, my fortress of solitude. I sat in my designer chair, the one made from recycled ocean plastic, and watched the sun set over the city. The light turned the sky a bruised, angry purple. I was right. I knew I was right. The world was a disaster of power and ego, and I was the only one with the courage to call it out. I opened my laptop. I began to type the new post. Asterisk, the tragedy of the modern activist is the inevitable betrayal by those too weak to handle the weight of total transparency. Today, I stand alone, not because I have failed, but because I have refused to blink. In the vacuum of the compromise, I am the only breath of pure air, asterisk. The screen glowed in the darkening room. I hit post. I waited for the likes. I waited for the validation. I waited for the digital world to tell me that my isolation was a badge of honor. The notifications didn't come. I sat there for hours, the only light in the room coming from the cold, blue glare of the screen. I was independent. I was uncompromised. I was perfectly, ethically pure. And I had never been more alone in my entire life. I looked around the room. The walls were still there. They were solid, painted a neutral, non-aggressive gray. I had fought so hard to tear down the walls at the collective, thinking that the lack of barriers would bring us together. But I had only succeeded in creating a world where there was nowhere to hide, and therefore, nowhere to truly be. I had turned my life into an open office, and now, the only person left in the meeting was me. I reached out and touched the cold surface of the wall next to me. It felt real. It felt solid. It felt like a boundary. For the first time in years, I wondered what it would be like to be on the other side of it. I wondered if there was a world where people were allowed to have secrets, where people were allowed to be problematic, where people were allowed to just be. But that was a dangerous thought. That was the path to liberal complacency. I pulled my hand away. I straightened my posture. I looked back at the screen. I would stay here. In the light. In the truth. I would stay here until the world caught up to me. Even if it took forever. Even if the silence became so loud that I could no longer hear my own thoughts. I am Abby. I am 21 years old. I am an ethical auditor. And I have everything I ever wanted. The room grew colder as the night deepened. The city outside hummed with the sound of thousands of people, all of them living their flawed, messy, unaudited lives. They were out there, in the dark, connecting and failing and trying again. And I was here, in the light, perfectly still. I picked up my notebook again. I opened to a fresh page. My pen hovered over the paper. Subject A, I wrote, my hand trembling slightly. Asterisk subject A. Is beginning to feel the effects of prolonged exposure to a vacuum. Asterisk. I stared at the words. They were the first honest thing I had written in months. I wanted to cross them out. I wanted to tear the page from the book. I wanted to bury the evidence of my own human frailty. But I didn't. I just sat there, in my perfect ament, in my perfect life, and watched the ink dry. It was a start. Or perhaps it was the end. Either way, the audit was no longer about the world. The audit was about me. And for the first time, I wasn't sure if I was going to pass. I spent the next several days in a state of suspended animation. I didn't go to my classes. I didn't answer the few emails that came from the university administration asking about my incomplete internship credits. I just existed within the four walls of my ament, watching the way the light moved across the floor, tracking the dust motes as they danced in the air. I started to think about the Global Sustenance Group, the entity we were supposed to merge with. I looked them up online, not with the intent of finding problematic ties, but with a genuine curiosity about what they actually did. They built irrigation systems. They provided microloans to female entrepreneurs in sub-Saharan Africa. They funded schools. Yes, they had corporate ties. Yes, their board of directors was predominantly male. Yes, they were of the very system I despised. But they were doing something. I looked at my hands. They were clean. Too clean. They hadn't built anything. They hadn't helped anyone. They had only ever pointed out why what others were doing wasn't good enough. I felt a wave of nausea. It was a physical reaction to a theoretical crisis. My intellectual superiority theory, my armor, was cracking, and the real world was leaking in through the fissures. I thought about Marcus. He wasn't a hero, but he was a man who stayed in the office until 9 p.m. every night, trying to figure out how to keep the lights on. He was a man who had tolerated my arrogance because he genuinely believed in the inclusion he preached, even when that inclusion was being weaponized against him. I had called his benevolent smile a performance of power. But maybe it was just a smile. Maybe it was just a man trying to be kind to a young woman he thought had potential. The realization was a blow to the solar plexus. If Marcus wasn't a villain, then I wasn't a hero. And if I wasn't a hero, then who was I? I was just a girl who had made a mess. I went to the kitchen and poured myself a glass of water. The tap hissed, the sound echoing in the empty room. I looked at the glass, a minimalist, hand-blown piece of art that cost $50. It was beautiful. It was ethical. And it felt like a weight in my hand. I thought about the open office again. I had framed it as a panopticon of the people. But a panopticon is a prison. I had tried to turn a workplace into a prison of constant surveillance, and I had been surprised when people wanted to escape. I had mistaken transparency for trust. I thought that if we could see everything, we would understand everything. But seeing isn't understanding. Seeing is just looking. I had looked at everyone, but I hadn't understood any of them. I hadn't understood their fears, their pressures, their needs. I had only understood my own theories. I sat down on the floor, my back against the oven. The linoleum was cold. I thought about my social media report. I thought about the thousands of people who followed me. I realized that they didn't follow me because they wanted to be better. They followed me because I made them feel better about being angry. I provided them with the vocabulary to justify their own isolation, their own judgment, their own purity spirals. I was a merchant of resentment. I took my phone out of my pocket. I looked at the screen. I looked at the app icon. With a sudden, sharp motion, I deleted it. The icon vanished. I felt a momentary sense of panic. My network, my audience, my relevance, all of it was gone. I was no longer an ethical auditor to the masses. I was just a 21-year-old sociology student in a quiet ament. But after the panic, there was something else. A lightness. I went back to the notebook. I picked up the pen. Subject A, I wrote, has decided to stop observing. I closed the notebook. I didn't put it on the shelf with the other volumes of my field notes. I put it in the bottom drawer of my desk, under a stack of old textbooks and discarded drafts. I walked to the window and opened it. The city air rushed in, cool, noisy, and smelling of exhaust and rain. It wasn't pure. It was filtered through 1,000 different lives, 1,000 different struggles. I leaned out, breathing it in. Down on the street, a man was helping a woman carry a heavy stroller up the stairs of the subway entrance. She thanked him, and he nodded, continuing on his way. 6 months ago, I would have analyzed the benevolent sexism of the encounter. I would have noted the patriarchal assumption of female physical inferiority. But today, I just saw a person helping another person. I saw the benevolence. And for the first time, I didn't think it was a dirty word. I stayed at the window for a long time, watching the world go by. I didn't have a theory for it. I didn't have a report to write. I didn't have a test for anyone to pass. I was just there. I knew that tomorrow I would have to start the hard work of making amends. I would have to call Marcus. I would have to find Sarah. I would have to apologize, not with radical terminology, but with simple, human words. I knew they might not forgive me. I knew the collective might be gone for good. I knew that I had consequences to face, financial, academic, and social. But as I stood there in the wind, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. I felt real. The walls of my ament were still there, but they weren't a fortress anymore. They were just walls. And for the first time, I knew where the door was. I walked over to it, placed my hand on the knob, and turned. The hallway was dim. The carpet was slightly worn, and the neighbor's dog was barking somewhere in the distance. It was imperfect. It was messy. It was unaudited. And I stepped out into it, leaving the light on behind me.